In a San County almanac, Aldo Leopold writes of two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other is that heat comes from the furnace. These are not only errors of thought, he refers to them as spiritual dangers, because they evince our estrangement from what he famously calls the land. To take the grocer and the furnace as facts of life is to lose sight of the gross chain of production, or what he refers to in more intimate terms as the middlemen, those who constitute our relations in their fullness. Under modern conditions, one can hardly remain aware of the impact of one's own consumptive habits, perhaps imagining that the land will yield endlessly. Abstraction from one's relations readies the mind for a utilitarian outlook on its environment. It uses more than it knows, it touches more than it can feel. Broken away from the great web of life, abstraction dreams of a life without consequences and makes preparations for eternal plunder. Leopold worried about these abstractions mainly as an existential problem. Abstract relations amount to alienation from the land and the spiritual impoverishment of a self that can no longer find its home among its relations. But he might have also worried about the fate of those middlemen, or maybe even those last people, those who find themselves so abstracted. For them, the dangers are not spiritual, for there is nothing less abstract than suffering for those who suffer. Abstraction for us may mean that we participate unwittingly and perhaps unavoidably in systems of mass exploitation and violence. This exploitation and violence is for others a precarious reality. I begin with Leopold because he expresses incomparably well what I wish to advance as a critical problem of our time, that ours is a time of mediation. We do not know who grew our breakfast. We do not know where our clothing was made. We do not even know who is in this room. As chains of production expand in scope and scale, our relations become increasingly opaque. There is much buzz about the reach of global transactions, about unprecedented interconnectivity. The inverse of this equation is our inability to comprehend this reach. Perceptions falter before complex planetary processes. Our language cannot hold these distances. Our brains were not built to make these leaps. In short, we lack the competencies to manage our moral lives under abstract conditions. A clean conscience comes with a heavy price. In what follows, I explore how modern forms of mediation enable widespread participation in the cultural production of violence. For the purposes of this paper, I take as axiomatic that humans respond to the perception of another's suffering. Yet this perception, and by extension human response, is inhibited by two forms of mediation that I'll talk about today. One I'll call abstract mediation, the other I'll call background mediations. I'll only have time to describe these two forms of mediation and several strategies already very much in play, I think, as you all beautifully demonstrated today, for counteracting them. By way of conclusion, I raise further questions and briefly allude to the role of scholarship in addressing what I take to be a defining problem of our time. For the first class of mediations, I take as my representative case the fictional mafia boss who turns away from the execution. Having given the command to murder, he turns his back to the scene of the crime. Hands folded over his suit jacket, he maintains his propriety as he waits for the sharp sound that signifies a job completed. He may even give a small start at the sound, but all other unpleasantries are kept safely out of view. This kept out of view seems to be what is most important in preserving his sensibilities as one who doesn't bloody his hands, doesn't do dirty work, or perhaps even one whose hands remain unbloodied. One marvels at the failure of imagination in these cases. What difference does it make that one sees the consequences of one's actions? What difference does it make if actions follow from words merely and not from one's deeds? I turn my back on the scene of the crime. As consequence recedes from view, so does it seem that I am free of those consequences. Modern urban life has perfected this turning away. The corridors that once protected affluent suburbanites from the spectacle of inner-city slums on their way to offices downtown have been replaced by gated enclaves in neighborhoods with heavy police presence. The seductions of the department store, whose studio lighting and saturated colors blot out the dark corners of the globe where small, tired hands manufacture clothing is replaced today by a few clicks that make Amazon deliveries magically appear at your door 2 days later. Meat presents itself in shiny styrofoam packaging, de-skinned and deboned, the factory farm a cognitive light year away. The consumer cannot possibly comprehend the entire chain of production, the number of hands and machines through which a single product passes. Convenient, ready to use, easy access. These phrases come at the price of further abstractions. One no longer has to hear the final sounds of suffering. It is almost as if one didn't give the command. These mediations involve different people in different places, different productive processes and different consequences, but for the purposes of mediating between perception and suffering, they all follow the principle of the one who turns away. I therefore call this class of mediations abstractive. Abstractive mediations facilitate suffering simply by inhibiting perception. It is essentially a technique of distancing. These distancing procedures tend to inhibit the perception of suffering, or at least interject abstractive media between actions and their consequences, so that the sources of suffering become harder to trace. Should an individual become aware of suffering, it will still be difficult to trace one's actions to the site of this suffering. Modern life relies on abstractive mediations to preserve moral sensibilities on the one hand, and excessive living on the other. Modern life remains intact through the selective occlusion of information in collusion with our own stunted powers of imagination. If abstractive mediations rely on occluding both suffering and its sources, then we can expect that counter-strategies will try to expose them. This is what I take journalistic reporting to be doing much of the time. Reporting exposes suffering not immediately available to perception, and thereby acts as an extension of perception to suffering otherwise hidden from public view. As for the sources of suffering, reporting will also provide further information, which fleshes out crucial details pertaining to suffering sources. Of course, this is where the interpretation of events becomes key in how narrative matters. Reporting remains its own kind of mediation, which is why it is called media. And a further problem for us is to puzzle through how in modern life, increasingly mediated by digital technologies and competing sources of news and social media, how this creates multiple overlapping and competing ecologies of information that are not geospatially fixed. A final point about the media strategies that aim to overcome abstractive mediation is that suffering often remains at an effective distance where these distances matter for the avenues of human responsiveness. Reporting often couples textual information with graphics that display suffering more viscerally than text can convey. The images that show up each day in the New York Times or the video clips instrumental for the Black Lives Matter movement do a different kind of work to communicate suffering and generate the grief and anger that sustain movements. Repeated exposures to horrific events through media such as photography and film circulate through crowdsourced media outlets. This is one important way in which contemporary social movements are able to organize attention and direct moral energies. For the second class of mediations, we will ostensibly be moving from out there in the world to the interior realm of perception. I'm ultimately unsatisfied with the interior-exterior duality since I aim to show how perception as political terrain is itself a product of social structural arrangements. In other words, there are norms that tend to guide perception toward making particular kinds of inferences. Exemplary of the second class is the case of ideology. I'm no economic determinist, but I recognize that Marx had important insights into how the norms of perception govern a people in order to challenge or reinforce the status quo. In our own day, race relations in the United States and the more general category of the anthropos in the environmental humanities are important sites for rethinking ontologies of difference that structure perception and action in the world. In the early days of animal testing and in egregious cases of human rights violations, such as the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, researchers operated under the assumption that their test subjects either felt no pain or had a higher threshold of endurance. Anthropocentric and racialist ideologies of ontological difference facilitate suffering not by sweeping suffering out of view, but by structuring the very cognitive habits and assumptions that support social practices. I want to underscore that these norms of perception are structural features cultivated by public education and upheld by everyday transactions in social life, so that deviation from these norms compromise an agent's ability to function with respect to a given community. Ideology is an example of how institutions mediate human responsiveness to suffering in terms of the social norms of perception. I therefore call this second class of mediations operating below the surface of perception background mediations. While social movements work alongside reporting to bring suffering into public view, they also engage background mediations by demanding new norms of perception. Where ontologies and ideologies of social difference are at issue, these perceptual terrains can be contested in public through strategies of perceptual persuasion. This is what I take the famous I Am a Man marches during the Civil Rights era to be doing. Images of suffering and human vulnerability are also particularly powerful in making the demand for social change, haunting perceptions until necessary changes are made. And I point to maybe more relevant examples for us from today. We had images of children in handcuffs, the sort of images conjured of people locked like beasts in incarcerated conditions. So that's what I'm pointing to here. Whereas strategies to overcome abstractive mediations rely on the extension of perceptions to places hidden from view, strategies to reconfigure background mediations demand new ways of seeing. Of course, successful social movements often rely on both kinds of strategies. Mediations must both overcome and reconfigure perception at the site of perception. Okay, so I'm going to make my way toward a conclusion here. So while I'm holding your attention and without the time to really accessorize, I want to try a few questions on for size. If background mediations are only reconfigured but never overcome, doesn't that mean they are a class of mediations that never go away? In this age of virtual, reality-enhanced, experience-obsessed culture, prone to taking flights of mystical fancy, what cultural resources remain to us to shape this class of mediations to our satisfaction? And don't the multiple ecologies of information, many of them corporately produced, engender among us multiple ontologies so that what becomes less possible is political common sense, the precondition for action in a shared world? Is the problem not simply mediation tout court, but rather how to attend to suffering in this media-saturated environment in which there is too much suffering too much of the time? Competing with dozens of other claims upon our attention, in short, how do we cut through the noise? And finally, doesn't this all lead to mediation overload, desensitizing us to the many terrible things forced before us day in and day out? By way of conclusion, I want to draw our attention to the role of academics in engaging efforts either to overcome abstractive mediations or to reconfigure background mediations. A more activist approach works alongside reporting to aggregate data and advance compelling interpretations of that data in order to lend force to an issue of concern and expose that issue in its manifold relations. These efforts traverse mediations, extending perception to sites of suffering. A philosophical approach, meanwhile, tends to work with the concepts that constitute perceptual terrain: naming, adjudication, justification. This is the work of the Academy in terms of background mediations. Of course, much academic work aspires to accomplish both goals, and it is often the collapse of abstractions to bring suffering to light that calls for the renegotiation of those habits and assumptions that constitute everyday perceptions. That said, I hope you will agree first that perception is highly fraught political terrain, and second, that scholarship, insofar as it works to question or reconstruct public concepts, is never politically neutral work. I hope this paper helps us to situate our work within the categories of the ecologies of information and the strategies shaping them that circulate in the Academy and beyond. Thank you.